Hi guys, I am here with another true story. Okay, this one has a verse before it by John Updike, and it says, "Dreams come true without the possibility nature would not incite us to have them." Alright, and this one is called A Prayer of Reunion. Betty and Andy sat on the couch shoulder to shoulder, reminiscing over the decades as they turned the pages of the family photo album. Two of the oldest photographs dated from the 1940s, a young soldier, fresh-faced and sharply dressed, at a kitchen table next to a chubby, dimpled baby in a high chair. The next photo showed the baby boy on his rocking horse. In the pages that followed, an older boy with the same dimpled chin smiled at the camera on trips to the lake, at picnics with cousins, and from behind glowing birthday candles. The man in the uniform, the baby's father, was no longer in any of those photos. "Wouldn't it be nice to know whatever happened to your dad?" Betty mussed. Andy didn't answer. Long ago, he'd put the question to rest. He assumed, or maybe he'd been told, that his real father was dead, killed in a car accident, but he'd never heard the details, never seen the grave. A nagging doubt persisted about his father, but when he asked his mother, she simply replied, "Don't ask me." So he stopped asking. For almost 60 years, he tried not to think about his story. It was the story of his life. But with crucial pages ripped away, Betty decided to pray about it. She clasped her hands together and bowed her head. "Dear God, help my husband learn the identity of his father." 1,200 miles away, an old man's fingers picked up a curled photo and looked at his baby son. The edges of the photo were worn thin. For 58 years, instead of holding his son, 2 photos were all he had to hold. Their stained and torn edges showed the love he'd received, poor substitutes for the child himself. "Take a good look at this kid," his wife Mildred had said sharply when she took their baby and slammed the door back in 1946. "It'll be the last time you ever see him." It was a wartime romance that ended when the war ended. George Henderson didn't believe her at first, thinking the threat was just angry words of a failed marriage, but she was right. He was never able to find her or his son after that. Eventually, he moved back to his home state of Kansas. George remarried later on and moved to Topeka, where he'd grown up. But he never stopped looking, wondering, wishing he could find his son. "I wish I knew where Andy was," he would say. Relatives and friends pitched in from time to time, with phone calls and internet searches, one fruitless search after another. One day in 2003, Topeka's water clerk, Gloria Holster, learned from a nephew that George had a long-lost son, his only child, and heard about George's futile search over the years. Gloria had always liked George and enjoyed chatting with him when he came into the city hall to pay his water bill. She'd had some success tracing her own family history, so she decided to put her skills to work. With the initial sleuthing, Gloria found that George's child was still alive. His last name was no longer Henderson, but Kellogg. Knowing that George's first wife was originally from Nevada, she searched for Kellogg in that state. Jackpot. 10 names downloaded onto her screen. Andy Kellogg, Las Vegas, Nevada, was the last name on the list. Gloria excitedly called George's nephew and told him that perhaps George's son was alive. She gave him the phone number for Andy Kellogg. But wasn't it too late? George's wife and relatives were worried. 58 years had passed. George was 87. It was crazy to open up a Pandora's box of potential ill feelings and anger. What if his son wanted nothing to do with him? George's circle of friends and relatives cautioned. He might say, "You're a stranger, I don't know you." "I'll accept that," George said calmly. A relative in Nevada made the first contact, dialing Andy Kellogg in Las Vegas. But the voice of this Andy was too young. It turned out to be Andy Kellogg's son, also named Andy, who gladly provided his dad's unlisted telephone number. After hanging up, the youngest Andy Kellogg called his father. "Dad, I've got a grandpa!" He shouted into the phone. His father was perplexed. "What are you talking about? Your dad is alive." Andy Kellogg hung up the phone and looked over at Betty. "Didn't you just ask me not 2 weeks ago what happened to my dad?" She nodded. "I remember. And I prayed about it." She nodded again. "Well, your prayer has been answered. He's alive. He's going to call me." A few days later, the call came. The tears flowed, and when George and Andy finally met in a tearful reunion at the Topeka airport, father and son found their similarities, bridged the decades with almost no effort on their parts. It was like we had known each other a long time, Andy said. When you wait that long, you just don't think it's going to happen. George marveled. Andy and Betty met dozens of family members, even some of the people whose names were listed in Andy's baby book, people who'd given him gifts at his birth. "I like this family. It's just like we have known each other all our lives," Andy marveled. Thanks to a God-wink link, the loving help offered by the caring town clerk. A father and son were reunited after 58 years, just 2 weeks after a wife's prayer was lifted up to God. At the Henderson and Kellogg homes are new photos in the family albums, the kinds that families cherish, photos of a father and son, arms wrapped around each other, beaming with love and contentment. It's never too late, no matter how old you are. It's never too late.